Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Caitlin. I'm one of the locally optimistic admins, and I generally organize these shindigs. And we've got spectacles today. I'm really excited. So Dylan, Josh, Tom, I will hand it off to you.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. So I'm Josh Temple. I'm joined by my co-founders, Dylan Baker and Tom Miller. Tom Miller, who is not wearing spectacles today. He's not on brand. But yeah, we're excited to be here. We wanted to also just say thank you to Caitlin and to Locally Optimistic for inviting us, because we've really benefited from this community over the past few years. And we hope that whatever we're sharing with you today will be just as helpful as you've all been to us. So today we're going to be sharing about Spectacles, which is a solution we've built to provide continuous integration and automated testing for Looker. So I'll just share my slides and we'll get started. All right. So before we get too deep into what Spectacles is, I want you to just take off your developer hat for a minute and remember what it felt like to encounter an error like this while clicking around a website. So before I became a developer and I knew about stack traces and HTTP status codes, I remember coming across messages like this and just feeling super confused and even a little bit frightened. Like as a kid, I remember coming across one of these Apache server error pages and it just said forbidden in big black letters at the top. And for a minute, I wondered like, if I'd done something wrong or if I'd broken something. So you come across things like this, you wonder, is the website broken? Is it outdated? Does anyone know that I've come across this error? And at its core, it makes you question the implicit trust that you have in the people who are maintaining the website. So ever seen an error like this before? Or maybe like this before? Right, look familiar? So imagine you are a non-technical Looker user at your company and you come across one of these. Now the first one is pretty readable. You could probably figure it has something to do with the shipping date not existing anymore. But the second one, I mean, that might as well be written in Latin, right? And so if you are part of a fledgling data team or you're trying to win over your enterprise to how great business intelligence and analytics can be, these kinds of errors can be really counterproductive to your goals. And maybe even more concerning is what about all the errors that don't get caught? So these one gets flagged right to the user and they can't go any further, but what about duplicates in your underlying data that cause a measure to be inflated? Or what about a metric that's not correctly calculated in LookML? So the bottom line is that errors make it a lot harder to build trust with your users. And trust is that most important currency when it comes to working in data. So what can we do about this? How can we reduce those errors that are present and are going to happen as we develop in Looker? So Looker has a few tools to help with this. We can run the content validator to make sure we don't have missing references to our LookML. We can write LookML data tests as assertions. But those tools mostly are run manually. They don't, they're not usually automatic, and they still don't validate the underlying SQL. So I can write perfectly syntactically correct LookML with utterly garbage SQL inside, and Looker will be fine with that. It will let me commit it and save it and everything. So what we see a lot of LookML developers doing is something like this, where they go into an Explorer and they click every single dimension in the Explorer, and then they click run just to make sure that the SQL that they've written isn't generating any of those nasty database errors. And I mean, wow, this is just not efficient. So there has to be a better way. So Dylan and I met at a Looker meetup about a year ago. We got to talking. Dylan was like, I wish I would pay someone to just build a tool that would do this action of clicking every dimension in an automatic fashion. And we thought, hey, we could come up with a better solution than this. So the solution is really automated testing. And so software engineers have been doing this for a long time. The data world is catching on as well. That automated tests are the best way to catch these unexpected errors and, more importantly, give you peace of mind. So you write tests that validate your assumptions. You configure them to run in a framework automatically whenever you introduce new code. And that's what's known as continuous integration. or CI. And it's for catching errors with automated tests before they get to your users and damage the trust that they have in you. So how might this work in Looker? So let's imagine you are a Looker developer and you're writing some changes into your company's instance. You push those changes and you put them on GitHub. Next thing is you're going to request now you're done with that work and you want to merge it in. So in a continuous integration framework, and what we're going to show you today, Spectacles is that test framework. So Spectacles will run a bunch of tests automatically on your Looker instance. And let's say those tests fail. Those tests fail, you know what you did wrong, hopefully, and you can go back and investigate and fix those errors, push them up again, and restart this cycle. So let's hope that you got it right. Those tests pass, and at that point, you can go ahead and merge those changes in. And so this is how continuous integration works, and this is especially how Spectacles work, where it allows you to define different validators that test different things in Looker for issues and catch them before you merge those changes into production. So I'm going to transition now over to Dylan. Dylan is going to give you a demo of Spectacles and how it works. Dylan, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Just as I was saying, let's do the standard Zoom bit and ask if you can all see my screen. Perfect, thumbs up. Cool. So as Josh said, there's a number of different areas that can kind of get introduced into a Looker instance through kind of no one's fault, and that there's no automated way to catch them. And so this is actually our Looker instance. This is data on the runs that happen in our application. And I want to run a query that says something like, 4 runs that were created in the last 7 days, how many are in each status? And so it's like a reasonably basic query. I come as the end user and I get this error. And I got this error which says, has a bunch of SQL, as well as saying, clearly there was an error in BigQuery and it failed to retrieve data, the name status not found inside runs. So it looks like this column is problematic. And in the kind of pre-Spectacles world, there isn't a very nice automated way of catching these types of errors. And so what I'm now going to just show is what that looks like within the Spectacles application. So if I come over here, this is like a kind of blank canvas of the Spectacles SaaS app. What has happened before we've come today is that I've provided it with credentials, an API key and secret to my Looker instance for a user, and I've done the authentication flow with GitHub. But otherwise, it's a completely blank slate. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go set up a suite. And a suite is a configuration for jobs, for things that end up generating runs effectively. And so I'm just going to call it, let's validate SQL. And so I've got a couple different things. We can either have it run on a schedule. I'm not that interested in that right now. But when pull requests occur, I want these tests to happen against those pull requests. And so I'm going to tick that box. As Josh said, Spectacles is made up of a series of validators. We've actually got 3 in the open source tool that this is based on. Currently, 1 in the SaaS application, though this time next week, there'll be feature parity between the 2. The one that is currently in the SaaS application is the SQL validator, and it checks exactly the type of errors that Josh just talked about and that I've just shown in the in our Looker instance, where a bit of SQL that is stored in your LookML actually doesn't run in the way that your database wants it to. And so here we've got the SQL validator. I'm going to tell it to test everything in this project. We're testing our main project, which is called Spectacles, which is up here. I could exclude explorers. I'm not going to. If you have project dependencies, if you have interdependent Looker projects, we do some stuff around like pinning branches for that. I don't need that right now. And I'm then going to run in hybrid mode, and I'll talk a little bit about what those modes mean in a second. And we throttle the number of queries that we send to Looker. We don't want to completely bork your Looker instance, and so you can set how many concurrent queries you want to send to it. Actually, if we're running against BigQuery, if you're running against BigQuery, Snowflake, or frankly Redshift, you can do it with a pretty high concurrency. And so I'm then going to go in, I'm going to create this suite, and I'm going to click run, which is going to run Spectacles, the SQL validator, against our instance and return any error. So hopefully the one we saw and maybe some others. And so as the job is now queued and it's going to run in a second, what Spectacles is doing for the SQL validator is it's using the Looker API to find every explorer, find every dimension in every explorer, and then run SQL queries to test them. And so for the SQL validator, what it does is it basically runs a SQL query either at the Explore level, where it is everything, all dimensions for a single Explorer tested at once, or at a dimension by dimension level. And it runs those queries with a limit 0 and a where what equals 2, effectively a where false, to limit the amount of data that we process. So actually, it basically works as a dry run on BigQuery, or doesn't scan any data on Snowflake. So if I head across to Spectacles, to Looker now rather, and I go to our queries, we should see our Spectacles bot running a bunch. And so what happened first was it ran in hybrid mode. What happens is it runs first with every dimension within an Explorer in one query. And then if that fails, it then runs dimension by dimension in that Explorer to find the exact dimensions that are failing. So we can see, oh, it's actually just run off the page. But we could have seen that there was one for each. And now clearly something in web application, in runs rather, failed. And so we've now got a bunch of queries being run that just test Explore dimension by dimension, so we can see which one specifically failed. And so you can see here we've got a limit 0 to say don't return any rows, and where 1 equals 2. And this was the thing we learned. Limit 0 on Snowflake actually doesn't limit it scanning data, but a where false does. And so we do a couple of different things depending on what warehouse you're on to make sure that we don't scan any data. And so it looks like that is done. So if we come back here, we can see that our job failed. And so we've got 2 Explorers in here. We've got the Organizations Explorer and the Runs Explorer. One passed and one failed. And if I click full details, we actually get that error that we saw. So we've got failed to retrieve data, name status not found inside runs. And so I'm going to now go and try to fix that. We've got Spectacles set up. I found this error that exists in production. I can't run this right now. No other user could run this right now. Always going to get that error. So we're going to jump in and try to fix it. So if we click LookML, it takes us to the specific line. And it's this one here. It's one, you can see here, it's 156. And so it's this one that's a problem. So I'm going to move into development mode. And let's say I think, okay, well, I remember maybe I was doing some DBT modeling, and I remember that actually somebody renamed this recently, and they clearly just like forgot to come to Looker and change it here. And I think they maybe called it status run. I don't bother going to check the database or whatever it may be. I'm just going to save that. I'm going to validate the LookML. And just to kind of like, I guess, prove Josh's earlier point, it has not done any, Looker has done no validation against status run to actually check, to like manage the contract between your warehouse and Looker. This is valid LookML. It was valid LookML before. It's still valid LookML. That's why the validation passed. But it hasn't actually tested that yet. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to commit this change. And I'm going to say status to status run. Actually, I'm going to do one thing really quickly, just to make sure we do this fast. I'm going to change this into batch mode just for the moment, which means that it's only going to run one query at the Explorer level that includes every dimension. So let's just update that. I'm going to commit this code, and then I'm going to go open a pull request because we force every Looker user to open a PR. They can't just deploy straight to production. So I'm going to open this PR. We can see the change here, create pull request. And immediately we can see Spectacles has kicked off the CI run. So it's now going to test, run those same tests, run that same SQL validator against that branch. You can see that we've got required here, which says this has to pass before somebody merges this in. So if I click here, and it's going to take me over to, oh, it's not great for a demo. Should take us here. And we're going to see that the same error occurs. And so now it says name status run not found inside runs. So it looks like I guessed effectively, and it wasn't quite right. In fact, it's called run status. But if we come back here, we can see that it's failed, and it's not going to let me merge. I'm an admin so I could merge it, but in theory, it's not going to let your average user merge it in. So there's something failing against Spectacles. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to push the correct change. Try it again. And it'll kick off another job. And in fact, it's shown up here. The job has immediately started. If we head back to Spectacles, you can see it here. And so hopefully that'll now pass. We'll wait here while it finishes its run. but hopefully it will now pass. Good, I know that I've resolved everything. No errors there. I get the green tick on my pull request, and I'm going to merge that in. And so this has done a few things for me. It's ensured that, one, I haven't pushed anything that is broken. And in fact, I fixed something that was broken. It gives me confidence that I can merge stuff in without having to run a series of like really manual tests myself. I work with a lot of users who use Looker day to day, and a lot of them like just go in and kind of like it's the chaos monkey type approach to testing, where you go in, you click a bunch of stuff, you check if it runs, and that's kind of like the extent of the testing most of the time. And so it saved that person a lot of time. The other person it has saved a lot of time for is the reviewer. So I would often tag this to be reviewed by someone. And part of the problem with reviewing LookML code is if I want to run the content validator, or I want to run data tests, or all those things on a branch, I have to go into the development area. I have to check out that person's branch, and I have to run all those things myself. Very shortly, the Spectacle SaaS application will also do all that. And so you as the user can have confidence in it, save some time, but also all your reviewers can review your code with confidence that it's actually going to work, and that they don't need to go in and check that you haven't broken any content in the content validator, and you haven't caused a data test to fail and a cert test in Spectacles. And that's, we found to be really powerful, and why we've built the SaaS application. So I'm going to merge that in. And on that note, I'm going to hand back over to Josh.
Awesome. Let me just share a couple more slides, and then we'll have some time for questions. We have a couple people on the call from Indigo Ag who have been using Spectacles as alpha users for the past couple weeks, so definitely encourage you to ask them questions about their experience so far. But before we get to that, I just want to talk about the roadmap for the product a little bit. So right now we are in an alpha stage. We have a few sort of handpicked people who are testing the product. At the moment, all of what Dylan showed you is in the product. We will soon be adding content validation and LookML test validation, which basically run those functions via the Looker API and return the results to you within Spectacles. So if you've ever had a problem with people not checking the content validator before they merge changes, that would be something that would be solved, where you could just basically enable that validator in Spectacles, and that would prevent any code being merged in that would break people's content. So a lot of powerful capabilities there. Then also some of the other things that we're looking at downstream. One is validating primary keys to make sure that the columns that you've listed as a primary key in Looker is actually unique. This gets especially tricky with derived tables, where you may not have the ability to test something like that in DBT or outside of Looker. So having confidence in the uniqueness of those columns is great. We're thinking about linting, and then we're also thinking about things like in-app quality metrics, like how many, how clean your LookML code has been, and things like that. So there's lots of exciting things to come. So what we would recommend you do if you're interested is go to our website, spectacles.dev, and sign up for early access. So once we exit alpha stage and go into a closed beta, people who are on that wait list will get priority to be added first. So if you're excited to try this out and partner with us in thinking about what good CI and automated testing looks like for Looker, definitely head over there and sign up, and we'll be in touch with you shortly. But that concludes our demo. So I'm going to hand it back over to Caitlin, and we'd love to hear any questions that you have. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Any questions? I can ask questions, but I'll open it up first.
Josh, I have a question on the content validator plan for the future. So we don't really pay attention to our content validator right now, mostly because there's so much that is broken in there. Like, it would be a huge undertaking for us to go and find things in people's personal spaces and make them fix it. Would there be a feature that would just be like, these really important dashboards we need to content validate, and if you break them, you can't merge your code? Would that be part of what you guys are thinking of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I think we're all pretty familiar with, is like, you just kind of give up on the content validator after a while, especially with big Looker instances. So we've added some features already that facilitate making that easier. One is that in the same for all of the validators, you can select specific explorers and models, and you can also exclude specific explorers and models. So if you have content that's built off of a model that's legacy, and you don't want to include it, you could exclude it there. We also allow you to exclude content in personal spaces, like you mentioned. So if this little test dashboard that someone made is breaking, you don't really need to see that. That's not core. And then the last piece I think is the coolest piece is we can run in what's called incremental mode. So spectacles will run versus master first, and then we'll run on your branch. It will only report to you errors that are introduced explicitly by the changes on your branch. So if you want to consider the things that are broken on master to be forever broken, that's fine. You can just fix incremental problems as they come up.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
So it looks like you're very robustly integrated with GitHub. Do you support GitLab or Bitbucket or any other Git options?
We don't yet. We'd like to. I'm a former GitLab user, so I understand the frustration of not feeling like tools are very well integrated, but starting with GitHub first, then we'll expect to roll out to other.
Who's up here, Sam?
I guess, Caitlin, what I'd add to your question is, while we don't integrate directly with GitLab or Bitbucket currently, you can still use a bunch of the functionality except the pull request functionality, which is, like, granted, a fairly big chunk of CI. But if you wanted to, like, run it just to test against master and run it on a schedule, we don't actually require the GitHub integration to do that. And so a use case we've seen is, I know we've got a couple of people from Fishtown and DBT here, but, like, if you have people developing on two different places, you can break something in Looker without having changed your Looker code. That can be your ETLs, like DBTs, someone doing DBT work or whatever it is. And so we found that people just running it every morning, particularly the data, like the assert functionality. So being able to, like, test all your data tests every morning and just going at 5 a.m. before your reports go out at 6 a.m. Like, every result that I've written a test for is within the right bound. Is useful even if you don't have the full CI functionality, though it is obviously just a subset of the features that we support.
Yeah, absolutely. That's still super useful.
Any other questions? I've got a question for the group to the extent that we're allowed to do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've mentioned a couple of validators, which have been things that either, like, matter to us or we validated with the like users, or that users came up with, and those are the SQL validator, content validation, data test validation, primary key validation, and linting. Are there any other things that people have found as they use Looker that they'd be, like, keen to test, that they maybe currently thinking, like, this looks great, but actually the thing I'm most worried about is why, and I'd really love for a validator to be built for that, because that's, I guess, part of, as Josh talked about, a lot of the roadmap is both making the existing validators, make sure they're really robust and building out the SaaS app, but also it's just, like, making sure that your coverage of your Looker instance is as broad as possible, and that includes any number of things. And we continue to discover what those are.
I think one thing that the content validator does not catch currently, and I don't think there is a validator for this, I think you'd have to just use the API, is alerts. If an alert is broken, there's no automated way currently to know about it, that I'm aware of at least.
Gotcha.
So I don't know what kind of priority that would be, and if that's something you guys are even interested in building out, but that's something that's come up with a couple of my clients recently.
Cool, yeah, that's really good to know, thank you. I think another thing we can, I guess, talk about to the extent that people don't have questions is, I think, as we've just talked about, like, integrating this up and down the stack is something we're thinking about a little. And so, you want to run it on LookML changes. You maybe want to run spectacles against a specific schema on DBT changes, for example. I'll use that as the, like, tool because we have a bunch of people from there here. But, like, conceivably, if you use DBT Cloud, against every pull request, it'll generate data into your Center underscore PR underscore account number underscore pull request number schema. And conceivably, there's a world where if you can tell Looker to query data in that schema as well, you could kind of test that all the way through. And so you could go all the way from like a change in DBT to make sure that you haven't broken anything in Looker, which is often where some of these problems, like I think the number of times where any of us have done work across these two tools, and you're like, this half of the work is in this pull request, and this half of the work is in this pull request, is just like a super common workflow for all of us. And so I think we're thinking about is how we test across that. And we're very far from integrating with other tools yet, but is kind of the types of workflow. We want to make sure that it's not just LookML changes that break Looker code. It's a whole range of things. And we want to make sure that we can facilitate people running against any number of those things.
What are the alerting options? So say you are running it once a day. Where do I get that information about a failure?
So email and Slack are going to be the two that we support initially. We haven't had any requests for anything else yet, in part because we found that anyone who wants to do anything else ends up sending an email to Zapier and doing whatever they want off the back of that. But so email and a Slack integration are going to be the two that we support first and foremost. It seems to be haven't had a request for Microsoft Teams yet or anything like that. So I think those are the two big ones.
Hey Dylan, Fabio here.
Fabio.
Glad to see the project's come along so far. It's looking great. I'll mention one test that I thought would be helpful. If for certain important data sets that you've kind of like marked, in addition to just testing that, it's not broken, maybe you could like run the query in production, run the query in dev mode. And if you're making a change that's not supposed to affect the outcomes of certain queries, just kind of like run this, it's almost like the data test, but rather than telling the Looker what the expected number should be, it just kind of like compares to the previous result, either within dimensions or just for the whole query.
Yeah, that's a really good use case. There's a tool, Josh, you're going to remind me the name, Datafold?
Yeah.
That does that kind of on the warehouse side, which are kind of does like diffs between data sets at the warehouse level, which is really cool. And I think it'd absolutely be interesting to see if we could implement that on the Looker side as well. Making sure nothing has changed in a meaningful way. I think one of the things that I'd say I'm thinking about a lot, particularly as it relates to the content validator, is like, what is and for that type of thing, like what is the flow that we should facilitate for people when they expect a change? Like people have different flows when they are using the content validator specifically. Some people, basically whenever you have to use the content validator, content is either going to be broken for a short period of time. It's either going to be broken before you merge your pull request or after you merge your pull request. You're either going to merge your code, have a broken dashboard, and then go fix the dashboard, or you're going to change the dashboard, have a broken dashboard, then merge your code, and it's fixed. And I think the thing we're thinking about is like, well, what's the flow for that, and how do we like have people notify us like when something is acceptable and when something isn't? Because the only flow that we really support is where you make the changes to your dashboard before you merge the code, because we want the content validator to show up as green on the test that we run. And so to do that, you need to change your dashboard before you merge in the code. And I think, so we're thinking about it in that respect, but I think that's another one where it's like, how do you flag and what's the user input and how does it affect like the Git flow? And how do we integrate with all the like version control systems to have people tell us when something's acceptable, something isn't? Is it just like an ad hoc override, or is there actual fuller, better integration that we build in that kind of like considers what that developer experience is? Because I think all of this for us is about improving what that experience for the developer is.
Yeah, I mean, I think for content changes, there are so many reasons why that might be okay. Like I know, for example, Facebook lints code, and then if you are in violation of the linter rules, it says, tell us why you chose to do this.
Right.
And if you have a good reason and you put it in there and your reviewer says, yep, that sounds legit, then you're good. And if it wasn't a good reason, then your reviewer says, go back and fix your shit. And to just kind of like acknowledge that this is an issue and tell me why it's not a problem.
Yeah, like like for transparency, we have tests against spectacles that like notionally stop us from merging if the test coverage regresses. If it regresses by like 0.02, we don't like, it technically blocks you from merging and when any of us go in and merge it in. Like there's always these use cases where you're gonna like overrule the technology.
Yeah, so it's like just giving them that opportunity to say like, well, why?
Yeah.
Dylan, Josh, great work on this. Very cool to see after hearing about it for so long. I wonder, what you just said made me think about like big, long-lived Looker instances that maybe have a lot of less desirable stuff in there. Is there a way right now, or do you envision a way to kind of like yes list, no list explorers that you actually want to validate, or different kind of severities for how much you care about checking them?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a couple ways that you can do that. Right now, we allow you to exclude models at the model level or at the explore level. So you can just completely kick something out that you don't want to be validated. The other thing that we allow you to do is you can insert a comment into the SQL that belongs to a dimension, and it's in our docs, but it's basically just like, we actually stole this from Fabio, who's on the call, and he used this in his linter, but it's a great idea. Is you just put a little comment that says spectacles : ignore in the SQL field of your dimension, and then spectacles will skip over that dimension. So there's a few ways that you can manage that. Like we have cruft in our Looker instance, and we don't want to, we know it's broken and we don't want to test it. So we've got a couple people on the call who have been using spectacles. So I wonder if maybe we can turn it over to them just to chat a little bit about what their experience has been like.
Sure. So hi, my name's Akshay. Work at Indigo Ag. Been using spectacles, first the open source tool since it was announced, I guess, at Looker Join this past November, I think. I honestly can't remember things from pre-coronavirus. Can you imagine there were so many people like in a convention center all together? Like that's a wild thought to me these days.
Yeah.
So we've been using it since then, and honestly, it's cut down significantly in our review time. So the way that our team works, Brian and Ellen, who are also on the call, our team works in a way that we are the main platform owners for all things Looker related. So we are the reviewers who are like the final say for whether any Looker code gets into any of the various Looker repos we have. So currently we have our projects pretty spread out depending on like the part of the business that uses the Looker repo. And an issue that we had previously was that like it took a significant amount of time for us to in-depth review code, because one of the things we had to check previously was that like, is their SQL even correct to begin with? And like that was the first and the biggest thing that the spectacles tool kind of cut out of our workflow, which was like, we can now go into reviews assuming that at the very least their syntax for their SQL is correct and that their syntax for their LookML is correct. So we can focus on other things like, is this the correct design for what they're doing, or if there's some better way to accomplish the same task. That's the main thing that we saw the most upfront value in. And then it's been super great working with Josh and Dylan, because like when we come up with something that doesn't work for us, for example, we have a lot of dependencies across projects. It was awesome to see that like we brought up this as an issue and these guys took it as something to fix, and they fixed it pretty near after that. So far, I'd say it's been a really good success, and at least we are looking forward to further iterations on the SAS tool as well.
I would love to know from other folks on the call who are maybe not Spectacle users, kind of what coping mechanisms you've got now. Like everyone figures out the best alternative. My team puts a lot of screenshots into every pull request. So you have to show a clean content validator screenshot. You have to show a screenshot of everything you changed in action, proving that it runs. And if there's anything you can compare, you have to like show me a comparison across models that like the numbers are actually correct. But that's obviously a bit of a pain in the ass. But I would love to kind of know, like, what are the coping mechanisms people are using? What would this be replacing for them?
I can say just from my consulting work, I think I've seen a bunch of things. The one that's the most sophisticated and like easy to implement that I've seen people do is that they have a one-to-one relationship between explorers and looks. And so they've got like a directory where they have a look for each explorer that does include every dimension. And so they go in and when they add a new dimension, they go to the look and they update the look. And then they have a script that just like runs those looks on a schedule to check it, which is like similar to what we do and we found this out. I can't remember who it was. I think it's King in the UK who do this. And they posted about it in Discourse a couple months ago. And it's the closest I've seen to like what we tried to do. And it's like not unmanageable. Like that script is reasonably easy. You have a bit of a process, but like it is okay as long as someone remembers to do it. That's the most I've seen in my work. The only thing I've seen at the other end is like just the like kind of chaos monkey go in and check everything.
Yeah, I've lived that also. Or the check most things, but then discover like 6 weeks later that something was broken and you have not even realized. But no one else has realized either, so wasn't that broken.
Out of curiosity, with like, I think we've only got, to be fair, a handful of companies represented here with like multiple people, but how many people here are using Looker data tests to validate things in their Looker instance? Cool, okay. What's been interesting for us is like, you can actually use those data tests to almost do everything that we do if you're happy writing reams and reams and reams and reams of code. Because you can test that primary keys are unique. You can test that SQL runs if you just generate an explorer that selects every dimension. And so like notionally, you can also recreate it that way, which I've seen a couple people do. You can like have files and files of data tests and just like rely, granted it doesn't solve the content validation thing, but like you can do it that way, but you write so much code to get there that it just like doesn't make sense, or it is a bad developer experience. But like that's the other one I've seen is like just relying heavily on data tests to do a bunch of things that like maybe it should do, maybe it shouldn't.
Another nice synergy I'll just mention with Spectacles and the Looker data tests is in Looker, you can configure those data tests to be run before you can, I think, submit a pull request, or it's sort of like a gatekeeping step there in the Looker IDE where it will run those data tests. That's pretty good. One thing that you can do with Spectacles that you can't do with Looker with regard to those data tests is you can run them on a schedule. So to give you a nice concrete example, let's say you have a conversion rate metric defined in Looker and you'd never want that to drop below a certain value. You could probably set that up with an alert on a dashboard or something like that. But another way that you could do it is you could define a data test on that metric and say that it must be bounded by some range, and you can run those data tests in Spectacles on a schedule. So you'd get a notification of that problem after your ETL finishes or something like that before you have to go in and see it at the dashboard level.
What does pricing look like? Are we too early?
I'll take that. No, you're not. You're almost too early, but not quite. So the way it's going to work is there's going to be a base subscription fee, and it looks like it'll probably be about $250 a month for a single project and a single concurrent user. And so you can have, and that's a single concurrent run happening at a time. And there's a reason that we can come on to actually, I think is interesting as to like why that's important. But it's likely to be $250 a month for that, which is like all the validators. We don't like gatekeep any validators on different tiers. And as many like users developers as you want. It's really dictated by the one Looker project and the number of concurrent runs that you can have at a time. And then it'll scale from there with either the number of projects you want to use or the number of concurrent runs that you want to have at a given point in time. And the concurrent runs bit is important because the way Spectacles works is that you give it Looker API credentials, and when it starts running, it authenticates with Looker and then checks out that user to the branch that you want to test. And so let's say our job takes 10 minutes, and I open a pull request, and so it goes in and it checks out. It's using one user, and it goes in, checks out, and it checks out branch A, and it starts running all the tests on branch A. Well, if Josh kicks off a run or opens a pull request 3 minutes later, and so my job hasn't finished, if it uses the same concurrent user, it will go in and it'll check out branch B. And now everything that this first user was doing is the same as the second user, and it's moved to branch B. And so you get a bunch of false positives and false negatives on the first run. And so you need to make sure that you limit, if you're using the same user, you limit the concurrency of runs. And so the way we've gotten around that is that actually if you want to pay us for concurrent users, if you want to set up concurrent users, we will manage a pool of users for you. And we'll triage as the second job kicks off and the third job kicks off. If you have users allocated to us for those, we'll give those jobs, those users that don't have a job running at that point in time. And it allows you to scale up your concurrency of this without having to worry about that. And the Indigo team can maybe talk about this more, but I know that early on when they were using Circle, that was a problem that they had. Is like two people would open pull requests at the same time, and the user effectively tries to be on two different branches, and you just get a bunch of like errors that aren't errors or things that don't error that should be, and just like a bunch of other odd behavior with the Looker API. But yeah, to answer your question, it's going to be about $250 a month for the kind of base level, and then add-ons there, and we don't necessarily have a good idea as to what the next tier up looks like. Currently, it's kind of base plus scaling specific things as you want. But I imagine as we figure out what the right kind of level looks like, we'll add another tier above that. So it's not directly linear with projects and concurrent users, that there's like a benefit of bumping up at some point.
How do you think about the open source side versus the self-hosted side?
Yeah. Josh, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So I think we have long been fans of DBT and of the open core model that we're seeing a lot in the ecosystem. And so we love that people can go and try out Spectacles. We also have been the beneficiaries of community contributions to Spectacles and people who've helped us improve the tool. So it's always going to be an open core model. But we've also talked to a lot of people who just don't want to deal with setting it up, or people who they want to use it aren't really comfortable setting up a command line tool and would rather use something with an easier UI. So that coupled with some of the concurrency issues that you run into when you try to run the open source tool in a CI environment means that there's a real market for the SaaS application, and we feel like people get a lot of value out of using it that way. Also, there's a good chance that the open source tool will be a place where we can try out new features and see what people think, and then roll them into the application if people are interested in them.
I think we're committed to, we are committed to like feature parity between the two. Like you'll never have a validator unless there's a technical reason that we can't. There'll always be, if you want to use the content validator, the data test validator, whatever it is, it'll always be in the open source tool as well as the SaaS application. I think the difference is around the deployment and all of that stuff and the value add that we provide on top of providing an SUI and doing a whole bunch of stuff. I think the validators themselves, there will always be parity between them. And like we see people who use the SaaS application and still have people when they're developing themselves use the CLI to validate their checks before they open the pull request. So there's, a nice, and frankly, it's how I develop when I'm doing in Looker. I will have Looker open in one window. I'll have iTerm or whatever it may be in the second window. I'm still running it myself, and I'm just replicating. But it means that because I'm not going to have that concurrency issue with my API key, and I don't need all the nice UI at that point in time. And so we see people who use both. Probably pretty similar to. We take a lot of inspiration from DBT, or I've been a member of that community for a long time, and it's kind of similar. That I think I've used DBT Cloud for years. I still also use the CLI day to day.
Awesome. Any other questions? Any other feedback? Anything you looked at that were like, hey, that's awesome, or I would never need that?
We are accepting a very candid feedback for what it's worth.
I just messaged our internal chat and I was like, Dylan's told me about this for months. I don't know why I haven't used this on any of my clients.
I'm clearly not a very good salesperson.
I think a lot of people have really been waiting on the fast side of it because Looker is such a UI dependent experience. So many of the users need the UI for it to click, or would just rather have it. Don't actually need it, but that's kind of where their brain is. I think it's hugely helpful to get that out.
I think that's right. I think there was a point where I was a Looker developer who probably had not heard of Circle CI. I couldn't have told you what Circle or Jenkins or I probably knew what GitLab was, but I didn't know what the CI component of Git. There's just a whole. What's great about Looker is it does empower people who were an analyst to do this type of data modeling, but they still CI didn't still hasn't quite entered their not vocabulary, but just the things that they're thinking about when they're developing. And I think that's in part that some of those people don't yet think of themselves as developers. And I think that's changing, and I think we hope to continue trying to change that. But I think that is still continues to be the reality for some people doing that type of work, even though they're going through the full software development lifecycle when they do work. They just haven't yet, they haven't had the mindset shift of thinking of themselves that way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The flow from Excel to Looker to everything else is such a big mindset shift for people who think oh, I'm an analyst. I work in spreadsheets.
Right. But particularly if that analytics team doesn't sit that close to your engineering team. Mm-hmm. If they're part of marketing or they're part of operations or they're part of whatever. I think I found that if analytics is part of engineering, the engineers see that they're in GitHub and start teaching all that stuff. And actually, a lot of the time I was in BI teams that were part of operations and marketing mostly. And my peers in my who I guess physically for a while back in the day sat near me, but I'm just dealing with day to day. You're the most technical person in that group most of the time as the Looker analyst. And I think that's changing, but that's definitely the case for some orgs.
Yeah, Dylan, I think I can provide a pretty unique perspective in that regard because I started at IndigoAg right before we started using spectacles, and I had no previous experience using Looker before that. And I also had no previous experience reviewing other people's code and having to uphold our SLAs that our BI core team has for the rest of the analysts within our organization. So to hop into that situation without having previous Looker experience was a little stressful to not really know Looker and also be expected to start reviewing other people's code. But having spectacles was super helpful in that it significantly reduced the amount of time it took me to ramp up at IndigoAg as a reviewer of code. One, because it was probably lowering my anxiety about giving feedback to other people's code that I just knew wasn't broken. So I was looking for things and I do this all the time to Ellen, I look for spelling errors now because I know her code works. But it also really lowered the barrier of entry for me to like get to the point where I felt comfortable reviewing other developers' code. And I think that's pretty important for our organization because especially like in Boston, it's kind of hard to find developers with a background in Looker in the area. So it's really hard to find talent that's going to fill like a BI core role. So I think it was pretty pivotal in like ramping me up and getting me comfortable pretty quickly.
That's awesome.
That's great. That's awesome. That's great to hear. I think talent is like, we all work in tech where I think talent is like, it's hard to hire well, and people are also going to hang around in the companies where their developer experience is positive. I think that's how like I personally think of it in terms of my experience. Is like there have been companies who've invested in the developer experience and there's companies who haven't, and I'm more likely to hang around in the ones where it seems like I appreciate that in this instance I'm selling, but I do genuinely that like it's you want to hang around places where like they've done the work to make sure you're like not wasting your time by doing the stuff that could be automated. And I think like a lot of stuff in the space is improving that. I think like to give Patrick a shout out, I think iteratively is like, that's a problem that I've seen over and over at companies, like that tracking plan type thing, like over and over. And like to the point that like there were people's jobs in product where they were just like their whole job was managing an Excel spreadsheet that had these things in it and like reviewing pull requests to make sure that that was aligned. Like that person leaves after 6 months because that's a really, really shitty developer experience. Like they're not even a developer, but just like employee experience. Like that you're paying someone a not trivial amount of money to do like a super like important but mundane piece of work. And so I think like those people leave. And so, or people leave those organizations generally. And so I think like, finding ways to make that developer experience positive is a lot of what I think about when we think about like building out this tooling.
Yep. So I know we're almost at time, so I will just encourage you once more to go to spectacles.dev, sign up for early access because we'd love to get you on the wait list and try this out. But thanks so much for having us today. And if you do have other feedback about the demo or ideas you have for the product, Dylan and I are on a couple different Slacks. You can hit us up in Intercom on the website, but yeah, let us know how we can make this awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for everybody who came and asked questions and gave feedback and all of that. It's been great.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.